In the summer of 1844, a small group of Texas Rangers was dispatched on a reconnaissance mission to survey the territory around a battle site on the Nueces River. Their mission was meant to be relatively routine, but after running into a massive force of Comanche warriors, it would turn into one of the greatest, most gruesome survival stories in the history of Texas. Tonight, join History at the OK Corral as we examine this little-known story in Showdown on the Nueces, South Texas, August 1844. As the confines of Nueces Canyon tower around them, a group of 4 Texas Rangers cautiously make their way down the Nueces River. Sent on a special mission on the order of Ranger Captain Jack Hayes. Their mission is to investigate the site of a recent battle, one that had taken place only 4 days prior amidst these undulating, limestone-strewn hills. They are to survey the battle site for any remaining dead, and to investigate the surrounding area for any sign of their avowed enemy, the feared and mighty Comanche. As the blazing Texas sun begins to reach its noontime apex, the Rangers decide to rest for lunch. They select a spot on a small tributary creek running off the larger Nueces. Believing their position to be secure, they appoint Rufus Perry to act as sentry, and then leisurely set about taking their midday break. They lay out their bedrolls and stake their horses out to graze, before tucking into a cold meal of beef jerky and hardtack. 2 of the Rangers, James Dunn and John Carlin, indulge in a swim in the cool waters of the creek as their horses water themselves. Meanwhile, Ranger Kit Acklin remains in camp, enjoying his meal, as Rufus Perry wearily stands watch over the camp. Perry is an experienced ranger, but even under his watchful eye, a group of Comanche have remained hidden in the brush only a few dozen yards away, completely unseen by the Rangers. The Comanche now manage to move into position to attack the camp, and then, in a whirlwind of war whoops and arrows, they strike the camp in a vicious ambush. Rufus Perry is the first to fall, struck by 2 arrows in the torso and 1 in the face. Kit Acklin manages to jump to his feet, but is hit moments later by a number of bullets in the torso, and then an arrow strikes him in the mouth. The arrow knocks out several of the young ranger's teeth and practically emulsifies the inside of his mouth. But despite these horrific wounds, he does not fall to the ground. Instead, Acklin pulls his revolver and manages to dispatch a Comanche warrior with a shot to the head. For a fleeting moment, the Comanche assault pauses as their fallen comrade causes many of the warriors to reconsider. However, seeing the condition of the wounded Rangers, the Comanche soon redouble their efforts, and another charge is made upon the Rangers' position. Acklin again pours a torrent of fire from his revolvers into the attacking force, again falling several Comanche. At the same time, Rufus Perry, despite his grievous wounds, manages to roll onto his side, and from this position, he too pours fire into the oncoming Comanche. With several more dead and dying warriors now lying prostrate upon the rock-strewn ground, the Comanche charge is again momentarily repulsed. Acklin, himself losing a considerable amount of blood from his own wounds, now rushes to the downed Perry. Perry's wounds are so severe that he is unable to rise and walk under his own power. So, the sizable Acklin heaves Perry onto his shoulders and makes a mad dash for the top of the riverbank, where, for reasons inexplicable to Acklin, the remaining 2 members of their ranger party, in Dunn and Carlin, have simply watched the fight unfold thus far. Both rangers are experienced in frontier combat, veterans of countless encounters with the Comanche. The question of why they did not come to their comrades' aid reverberates loudly in the mind of Acklin, and though he knows another Comanche attack is imminent, and that now is likely not the most prudent time to address the subject, he makes his displeasure known to Dunn and Carlin. Dunn and Carlin, for their parts, insist that charging headlong into the fight would have amounted to not only a poor tactical decision, but sheer foolhardiness on their part. Quoting author and former ranger Andrew Soul's later account of the battle in early settlers and Indian fighters in southwest Texas. Quote, "Their plea was that it was useless to make an attempt from their position on the river, and that they knew they would be cut off before reaching their companions. They had stripped off their clothing and were in the water when they heard the fight commence at the camp, and at once came out and mounted their horses without clothing, ready for the fight in case the Indians were too strong and plundering the camp." But after each man has briefly stated his case, all concur that this is no time for further arguments, as the Comanches swarm the hills around them. It is decided that they must cross the river in hopes of putting the Nueces between themselves and the Comanche. With Rufus Perry bleeding profusely, he is carefully laid across the back of one of the horses and then gingerly led across the river by Dunn and Carlin, leaving a trail of blood and gore behind them as they move through the water. Acklin, now without his horse, then crosses to meet his cohorts, himself leaving a trail of blood as he doggedly swims from one shore to the other. Once across the river, they now confer amongst themselves as to their next move. Perry, unable to load his revolver, asks Dunn to load the weapon for him. Dunn takes the pistol, but before reloading it, decides to scramble to the top of a nearby tree in order to gain a better vantage point of the Comanche. To his horror, he sees a Comanche force several hundred warriors strong, far larger than the Rangers had initially anticipated. He hurriedly descends from the treetop and breathlessly informs his companions of the size and movements of the oncoming Comanche. He exclaims that, quote, "The valley is full of Indians, and a large band of them is coming this way." Seeing no possibility of their tiny, wounded force being able to hold off an attack of this size and scope, it is decided that Dunn and Carlin, the only two Rangers who are uninjured and still with their horses, will make the lengthy, treacherous journey to San Antonio in order to procure reinforcements. The painfully obvious fact amongst the Rangers is that Acklin and Perry, too grievously wounded to make an attempt at retreat, are already effectively dead. Again, quoting from A.J. Soule in Early Settlers and Indian Fighters of Southwest Texas, "We will not judge the actions of these two Rangers too harshly. They said it was useless for them all to get killed. They looked upon Acklin and Perry as already dead, badly wounded and no horses to escape on, and it seemed that there was no chance for the two wounded Rangers left alone on the banks of the clear, beautiful river with a horde of yelling savages on their trail." End quote. Now, left alone and without any hope of escape, Acklin and Perry's minds race to the sickening memories of accounts of those Rangers unfortunate enough to be taken alive by the Comanche out here on the bleeding edges of Texas. Even in these early years of Texas, accounts abounded amongst Rangers and civilians alike of those who had suffered the endless tortures and depredations wrought by the Comanche upon their captives. Many young Rangers had perished after hours of being roasted alive under hot coals while staked out on the dry Texas plains. Many were found mutilated, with their arms, legs, ears, noses, and scalps cut off, often eviscerated and emasculated. It could not be known, but was widely assumed, that many of these mutilations were carried out on the victim while the unfortunate person was still alive. Now, seemingly left to this inevitable fate, Acklin and Perry are left with the simple, unavoidable question: will they allow themselves to be overrun and taken alive by the Comanche? Or will they fight until the bitter end? Despite their dire circumstances, Acklin and Perry resolve that they will either save themselves or die fighting. However, the pair are now without any weaponry, save for their large bowie knives, a mainstay tool for nearly all Texas Rangers at this time. To compound this problem, for all their resolve, Perry, his eyes now caked shut with dried blood, is practically blind. Acklin, seeing he is now the only relatively able-bodied one between them, decides that he will again shoulder his comrade and move their position up the riverbank to one that might be more easily defended. But just as Acklin is agonizingly positioning Perry across his shoulders and beginning to slowly rise to his feet, the shrill, piercing cry of the Comanche warriors once again fills the air. Though they are still across the river, the Comanche have now spotted the blood trails left by Perry and Acklin as they made their way to the water. Now, as if tracking a pair of wounded animals, the warriors begin to follow the blood trails and quickly surmise that the Rangers have crossed the river. Acklin, his mouth now nearly swollen shut from his own injuries, tells Perry, in words barely audible due to his wounds, that he will attempt to hide him and then attempt to hide himself in hopes of evading the oncoming Comanche. As the Comanche begin to cross the river themselves and precious seconds tick away, Acklin finally manages to strain his way to a standing position under the weight of Perry's nearly lifeless body. Then, taking as much care as possible to conceal their trail, Acklin makes his way upstream. For several minutes, he trudges on. Though both of the wounded Rangers' wounds have stopped bleeding, their compromised state makes any sort of progress seem virtually impossible. But, just as Acklin is ready to crumble to the ground, he spots a large plot of driftwood at the river's edge, covering roughly an acre in which fallen trees have been swept to this spot through various floods. With the Comanche now having crossed the river and rapidly closing the distance between themselves and the Rangers, Acklin gingerly sets his wounded comrade down before hurriedly crawling into the maze of driftwood and then pulling Perry in after him. As Acklin continues this harrowing process of crawling and pulling his wounded comrade along, they both hear the Comanche approaching. Finally, Acklin comes to a halt. In whispered tones, they agree that it is best that they split up, agreeing that if one of them is left undiscovered and able to physically recover, that man will make a run for San Antonio. Both men sense this may very well be the last time that they see each other alive, and with heavy hearts and few words spoken, they firmly shake hands, before Acklin crawls away, hoping to put as much distance between himself and Perry as possible in order to decrease the likelihood of them both being discovered. Acklin makes his way upstream, as Perry hunkers down where he is, unable to do more than listen, as the war cries of the Comanche fade. For a few ominous minutes, it seems to Perry that they have fallen into silence and perhaps abandoned their pursuit. Then he hears the whispers. Weary of the Rangers' firepower, the Comanche now attempt to approach their quarry as stealthily as possible, believing them to be cornered somewhere in this driftwood thicket. Still unable to see through the dried blood that cakes his eyes shut, Perry can only listen as the muffled voices and plodding footsteps draw nearer and nearer to him. To his horror, the Comanche walk directly over his position, each warrior skulking by at a rate that seems to Perry to be intentionally torturous. Still, he remains silent, and, miraculously, is left undiscovered as the Comanche continue their way across the thicket and further upstream. Though greatly relieved that the Comanche have passed him over, Perry's thoughts now center on his concern for his comrade Acklin, whose trail the Comanche have surely followed. All he can do now, though, is listen intently for the resumption of the Comanche's louder war cries, indicating that they have discovered Acklin. However, after a sickening few minutes of waiting and listening, Perry hears nothing. But despite this fortuitous sign, he knows the Comanche are intent on exacting their revenge for the warriors that Acklin has slain, and that they will not give up their pursuit easily. Still, despite being in agonizing pain and unable to see, Perry knows he cannot remain here in the driftwood for long. His only hope now is to make his way to the river, and then, somehow, navigate the 120 miles on foot to San Antonio. Now, the beleaguered ranger slowly crawls his way back through the driftwood thicket, guiding himself by feel and making his way toward the sound of the rippling water. After painstakingly dragging himself over rocks, branches, and fallen logs for what seems like an eternity, Perry's outstretched hands are finally greeted with the feeling of the slick, cool riverbank mud. Cautiously, he pulls himself to the water, and, after slaking his all-consuming thirst, immediately dunks his entire head into the cool river, seeking to ease its endless throbbing and to cool his overheated body. Finally, he manages to wash the caked blood from his eyes. He is greeted with the still darkness of night. Though he is relatively sure the Comanche have now left the area, he is still alone, without weapon or horse, in the middle of the Texas wilderness. With no other option, Perry again drinks heavily from the river, and spends a considerable time cooling himself and regaining some measure of strength before finally straining his weary body upright and, step by weary step, beginning the long, painful trek back to San Antonio. He knows that even if the uninjured rangers in Dunn and Carlin had made their way back to San Antonio and sent reinforcements, they will likely be unable to find either himself or Ackland, as both have ventured so far from the location where they were last seen. For 6 long days and nights, Perry makes his way northeast, the entire time suffering of thirst, starvation, and rapidly festering wounds. Finally, the bedraggled, blood-soaked figure of Rufus Perry is spotted by the ranger lookouts on the outskirts of San Antonio. He is so disfigured from his wounds and caked in gore that, at first, his comrades do not recognize him. When they do, he is quickly brought to the Rangers' headquarters, where he is informed that a rescue party, or what many have considered to be a recovery party, has already been sent out by Captain Hayes. During Perry's trek to San Antonio, Dunn and Carlin had arrived back to the city, both being badly sunburned and saddle sore, having made their escape wearing nothing more than they had while swimming. They had reported Rufus Perry and Ackland to be all but assuredly dead. Now, with Perry's reappearance, the Ranger headquarters becomes a whirlwind of activity, as all the men who can be spared are marshaled into a second rescue force that can span out in search of their lost comrade in Ackland. But just before they are able to ride out of town, and only 2 hours after Perry had appeared on the outskirts of San Antonio, Kit Ackland is spotted, himself nearly unrecognizable due to his wounds and physical deterioration. Ackland, too, is rushed to the headquarters, where he and Perry are attended to by the best doctors that can be procured in the whole of San Antonio. After a matter of weeks, the men are nursed back to health, and both will eventually rejoin the Rangers' ranks. While John Carlin will go unreprimanded for his conduct during the fight, James Dunn will be formally reproached by Captain Jack Hayes himself for not assisting his comrades in a more prudent manner. However, Dunn's reputation, as repeatedly noted by A.J. Soule in his account of this battle, remains strong within the Rangers. Soule tempers his narrative with the caveat that, quote, James Dunn was censured by Captain Hayes and others of the company, but he was a good Ranger and had no chance in this affair. He was looked upon as one of the most daring men Hayes had, end quote. Dunn and Carlin, too, will both go on to continue their service with the Rangers. Rufus Perry would eventually move to West Texas before returning to the Texas Hill Country, where he would pass away in Johnson City in 1898 at the age of 76. Kit Ackland, like millions of other Americans, including fellow Rangers Jack Hayes and Bigfoot Wallace, would make his way to Northern California in 1850 with the advent of California's gold rush. Here, he would settle in the Sierra Nevada town of Mariposa, where he would serve as a local constable until his death in 1871 at the age of 52. The story of Rufus Perry and Kit Acklin's impossible survival on the banks of the Nueces is but one of an endless succession of accounts of bravery, violence, and fortitude that are replete within the annals of Old West history. But the many stories of battles from the lives of Texas Rangers like Perry and Acklin, as well as the Rangers who fought beside them, and the innumerable battles between themselves and not only the Comanche, but the Mexican Army during the Mexican-American War, are, for tonight, other stories for other times. Thank you again for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. If you like this story, click on one of the videos on your screen now to watch more. Also, if you'd like to learn more about Old West history, be sure to sign up for the daily History at the OK Corral newsletter. Link is in the description. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.